Well, all eyes on Alaska today as President Trump's meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin ends with a short press conference with very few details. Let's bring in CBS News White House reporter Willie James Inman. He joins us live from Anchorage, Alaska. Willie, not the series of events we were expecting. Talk to us about that very short press conference.
Hey there, Liz. If you bear with me, I'm having some difficulties hearing you in my ear here. But this press statement that President Putin of Russia gave to and President Trump gave was really short. It lasted about 12 minutes or so, and both leaders spoke about the good relationship that they had with each other. But there was no mention of a ceasefire in Ukraine. President Putin talked about the need for Ukrainian security and that it was understood and that Moscow would work on that. But there was no mention in terms of that major development that we were expecting here. And the president said that it was a productive meeting. Take a listen to what he said earlier.
It was very profound, and I will say that I believe we had a very productive meeting. There were many, many points that we agreed on, most of them, I would say, a couple of big ones that we haven't quite got there, but we've made some headway. So there's no deal until there's a deal. I will call up NATO in a little while. I will call up the various people that I think are appropriate, and I'll, of course, call up President Zelensky and tell him about today's meeting.
Now, remember, the president talked about this earlier in the day. He essentially said that he wanted a ceasefire. He said earlier this week that he could potentially put more sanctions on Russia if it did not move towards peace. That did not happen here, and some are already viewing this as a win for President Putin. But there could perhaps be more developments. We could see a statement from the president after he has those conversations with European leaders, including President Zelensky of Ukraine. One last thing I'll note, Liz, there was a really interesting exchange between President Putin and President Trump. The president said, "We'll see you very soon," and the president of Russia essentially said, "Next time it'll be in Moscow," and President Trump said he'll get a lot of flack for that, essentially. So we'll have to wait and see in terms of that next meeting, because remember, President Trump said if today's meeting was successful, that he would quickly set up another meeting that would include President Zelensky himself and President Putin in the coming days. Liz?
Willie James Inman, live for us in Anchorage. Thank you so much. All right, let's bring in CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis. Hopefully she can hear me. Hi, Olivia. Trump and Putin spent a lot of time complimenting each other, and their greeting earlier today was very warm. What does this signal for the future of their relationship, do you think?
That really stood out today, didn't it? And especially because President Trump, before the summit even began, said in an interview that he was going to be not happy if he came away from it without a ceasefire in hand, and earlier had threatened severe consequences if the fighting didn't come to an end. But we heard not a whisper of either consequences or unhappiness from the president. You're right, there was pretty effusive flattery on both sides, with President Putin calling the atmosphere constructive and stemming from a place of mutual respect. President Trump referring to the talks as productive and saying they got a lot done, but saying there's no deal until there is a deal. He said he would be calling European and NATO leaders immediately after this meeting. As of right now, we understand from reporting from our Margaret Brennan, that call has not come through to President Zelensky of Ukraine, or at least to the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, a top U.S. ally. So still waiting for those phone calls to be made. We understand the president is doing another interview in the same room where the bilateral press engagement, if you can call it that, just concluded. So what we see coming away from this is Vladimir Putin has pocketed a lot of things. He's pocketed a warm reception from the U.S. president on U.S. soil, complete with a red carpet and a ride in the presidential limousine. He's managed to continue to delay promised U.S. sanctions that the president said were forthcoming were a ceasefire not to be reached. And he gets to continue to wage his war in Ukraine, which, given this is a grinding war of attrition, is to Russia's strategic benefit because the more time that Vladimir Putin has on the battlefield, the more his forces are incrementally, albeit at very high costs, advancing, especially in eastern Ukraine. So it is hard to see how this hasn't burnished Vladimir Putin's own standing, which is exactly the outcome that European leaders and Ukrainian President Zelensky feared.
And Olivia, I want to get your point of view on this. Putin raised the possibility of a meeting with Trump in Moscow. Take a listen to that.
And Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much, and we'll speak to you very soon and probably see you again very soon. Thank you very much, Vladimir.
Next time in Moscow.
Oh, that's an interesting one. I don't know. I'll get a little heat on that one, but I could see it possibly happening. Thank you very much, Vladimir. And thank you all. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
President Trump saying he might get a little heat for visiting Moscow. What would happen? What would have to happen before an American president could visit Russia?
It's a very good question. I think we have to see how this engagement plays because the overwhelming majority of the American public has an unfavorable view of Vladimir Putin. The president's own party has a majority unfavorable view of Vladimir Putin. The president has said the whole point of this engagement with President Putin was to stop having meetings about meetings about meetings. His special envoy, Steve Witkoff, had at least 5 engagements with Vladimir Putin in an effort to get to some sort of a ceasefire or, burgeoning peace accord with Ukraine. That had not come to fruition. The president had initially laid out the purpose of this meeting to be one in which he felt out President Putin, in which he sized him up, in which he got to look him in the eye and determine if there was a deal to be made. It was supposed to be conclusive. The president was supposed to be able to tell in a couple of minutes whether that was in fact going to happen. But in what we have heard, and again, the very small amount of details that we got coming out of this engagement, was that there seemed to be more meetings to be had. If there is supposed to be another bilateral meeting between President Trump and President Putin, that goes against what he indicated was supposed to be a primary objective of this meeting, which was to set the table for a trilateral engagement involving Ukrainian President Zelensky.
And Olivia, what can you tell us about the decision to involve the Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff in that meeting?
Yeah, there were a number of surprises about the plan for today. In fact, the president was supposed to have just a one-on-one meeting with interpreters with the Russian president. Mid-flight, after he was just about to leave Air Force One and descend in Alaska, it was made clear that Special Envoy Witkoff and Secretary of State Marco Rubio were going to join those talks, broadening the conversation and probably to the relief of some European leaders and possibly the Ukrainians, because there was a great concern that a one-on-one meeting could lead to something like a fait accompli with the President of the United States and the President of Russia deciding between themselves that they had come to a good enough deal that they could then sort of foist on the Europeans and Ukrainians and accuse them thereafter of standing in the way of a broader peace accord. Again, we are still waiting on details on the nature of the conversation. President Putin did, of course, have praise for President Trump. He name-checked the special envoy, Steve Witkoff. He did not mention the Secretary of State, who is known to be a Russia hawk. So we'll have to hear more about what the dynamics were in the room and a lot more about the substance of the conversation that took place.
Fascinating chain of events that happened today in Alaska. Olivia Gazis, thank you so much. Now, in addition to discussing the war in Ukraine, Russian President Putin suggested yesterday that he and President Trump might discuss a new nuclear deal between the two nations. Of course, we don't have any clarification if that actually happened. CBS News Pentagon reporter Ellie Watson breaks down what nuclear assets the U.S. and Russia have right now and when the current limitations expire.
The U.S. and Russia have the largest number of nuclear weapons in the world. Each country has thousands of nuclear warheads, but they're limited to how many they can deploy to just 1,550 at a time. That cap is set by the New START Treaty, the last remaining bilateral agreement between the U.S. and Russia on nuclear weapons. Those weapons, in the case of the U.S., can be on top of intercontinental ballistic missiles based here in the United States, deployed on submarines all around the world, or on Air Force bombers like the B-2, which actually did a flyover at the summit in Alaska between President Trump and President Putin. The limit on the number of nuclear warheads that can be deployed by that treaty is still in effect, but there are other provisions of that treaty that are not. For example, the treaty allows for 18 on-site inspection visits between the two countries every year, but those inspections have been suspended first by the COVID pandemic back in 2020 and then by Russia in 2023 because of its war in Ukraine. The treaty itself as a whole is set to completely expire in February of 2026, so just over 5 months from now. President Trump over the summer has talked about how he would like to see that treaty extended because not having restrictions on nuclear weapons is dangerous, but usually extending a treaty of this magnitude would be preceded by extensive talks. And between the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, that hasn't really happened. And now both sides have to consider another factor, which is the rapid nuclear breakout by China. China, according to the Pentagon, is on pace to projected to have at least 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. Back to you.
Ellie, thank you so much. All right, I want to bring in CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes. Nancy, you were in that room where that very brief press conference was held. I want to get your reaction to what happened there.
Well,
and
first,
I want to note,
Liz,
Nancy,
I don't know that we can call it a press conference.
Before you get going, Nancy, I just want to note the president is now getting on Air Force One. He's waving to the crowds there at the tarmac in Anchorage, Alaska, and he is presumably headed back to the White House after what was, as you were just about ready to mention, it was a very short summit and a very short press conference. Again, I want to repeat what I asked you. What were your reactions?
Well, my reaction was that because the president did not take any questions, because Vladimir Putin did not take any questions, technically, I don't know that we can refer to this as a press conference. That was what was supposed to take place, but instead the two leaders came in. They spoke to reporters for about 12 minutes total. They both made vague references to progress that had been made. Putin talked about some kind of an agreement. President Trump did not use that phrasing, and then they left without taking questions. It was a big surprise because President Trump had repeatedly previewed the fact that he was either going to have a big press conference with Putin if things went well or a solo press conference if things went badly. And so that has sort of left everyone to try to read between the lines and figure out if any real progress was made, and why, if the two leaders had come all this way, the meetings were cut short. And as you just pointed out, Liz, both men are now headed back to their respective capitals.
Yeah, and you see there live, Nancy, on our screens, President Vladimir Putin, Russian President Vladimir Putin, is departing right now. That is his plane on the taxiway there, about ready to take off any second now. And Putin said today, Nancy, that Russia is sincerely interested in putting an end to the Ukrainian conflict. We've heard President Trump say before he thinks Putin might be tapping him along. So what do you make of Putin's message there? Is it enough to reassure Trump that he's serious about actually ending this war? Because that wasn't clear today.
It's a message that he has uttered in public many times before. And that's what President Trump means when he says Putin is tapping him along. That Putin will say the right things. He will say that he wants peace. He will say that he is ready to end this 3.5-year conflict. But then when push comes to shove, and when Putin is asked to drop his long list of demands that he has laid out in exchange for a ceasefire or an end to the war, Putin is generally not willing to give those up. And so the question is, behind closed doors, did he give any of those things up? President Trump said he is going to call his European counterparts. He's going to call Volodymyr Zelensky and let them know what they discussed and what progress was made. And we're asking those questions to the White House as well, to officials. Where exactly did these meetings go? Did the two men find any common ground? Why weren't they willing to share that common ground if they reached it? And again, Vladimir Putin traveled 9 hours to get here. Donald Trump traveled 7 hours to get here. They were supposed to have 2 back-to-back meetings. They only had one. Then they spoke to the press and got out of here in a hurry. What does it all mean?
Yeah, and I mean, another thing that kind of stood out to me, Nancy, was the fanfare that greeted President Putin when he arrived in Alaska, and the pleasantries that seemingly were exchanged there on the tarmac when both leaders arrived. Then they got into the president's, they called the Beast, his limo, his presidential car there, and took them to the area where they were going to have this summit. And then during that press conference, they spent much of the time exchanging compliments to one another. What do you make of those exchanges?
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning of the day, President Trump was almost giddy. We saw him raise his arms over his head in applause as he waited for Putin to meet him on the red carpet on the tarmac. They exchanged pleasantries like the old friends that they are. And then, as you pointed out, President Trump issued this sort of rare sign of respect by inviting Putin into his motorcade for the ride to their meeting locale a few minutes away. And so it started out really well. And again, perhaps it ended well too. Perhaps there was some concrete progress made. But President Trump, if there's one thing we know about him, is that he's not shy about touting his achievements when he perceives that he has made serious progress, or when he perceives that there's something to tell the world about. So the fact that he was so vague and circumspect really does leave us with a lot of questions about whether this was just happy talk at the end, meant to paper over some very difficult conversations, or whether he wants to tell European leaders and Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine what he discussed first before he tells the world.
Nancy Cordes, thank you so much for your reporting all day long from Anchorage, Alaska, and for your insight in our show today. Good luck, safe travels.